Welcome to the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies. My name is Bernie Schlager. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm Executive Director of the Center. Before I turn it over to Dr. Ish Ruiz and/or Amy Toby, just a few housekeeping details for this Zoom workshop. It will be recorded and is being live streamed now. It will be recorded for later posting on our socials, but we will not record or post the chat feature. And so that's all the housekeeping details I have, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Ish.
I'm also going to take it from here. Thank you, Bernie. And welcome to our second Latinx Roundtable event of the Latinx Heritage Month, sponsored by the Center for LGBTQIA and Gender Studies in Religion, or as we affectionately call it, the CLGS. My name's Amy Toby, and I'm an MDiv student at Pacific School of Religion and an LRT intern. Thank you for coming back, to those of you who attended our first session on Mi Gente, and welcome to all those who are attending for the first time today. The CLGS's mission is to advance the well-being of lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and transgender people, and to transform faith communities and the wider society by taking a leading role in shaping public discourse on religion, gender identity, and sexuality through education, research, community building, and advocacy. They do this by providing a certificate in sexuality and religion through PSR's stackable degree program, events, and of course, the work at the Roundtable. The Latinx Roundtable is called to build a world where all persons, regardless of race, gender, sexual identity, or religious, spiritual affiliation, can flourish and live a life of dignity. LRT is committed to serving as a space where we can critically reflect on theological, political, cultural, and spiritual insights located at the intersection of queerness, Latinidad, and faith spirituality. We dream of a world where queer Latinx spiritual perspectives take active leadership in the journey toward what Christians refer to as the kingdom of God, a utopic eschatological vision where all persons can thrive. This panel will explore the concept of familia through a queer Latinx lens. Our panelists will reflect on the many ways familia is constructed and deployed in Latinx cultures, and will apply a queer reading of familial relationality, which includes biological families and your chosen families, to better understand, celebrate, and expand the scope of family in our contemporary diverse society. This has a significant implications for how we welcome all persons, especially queer people of color, into relationships. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Ish Ruiz, who will be our moderator today.
Hello, everybody, and happy Hispanic Heritage Month. My name is Ish Ruiz, and it is my pleasure to facilitate this conversation. I am excited. We have these two incredible guests with us today. But prior to turning over the microphone, so to speak, to them, I want to do a little bit of framing about our event today. We are going to be discussing the concept of familia, right? And as Amy explained, the LRT puts on programming and facilitates discussion and conversation about the intersection of queerness, Latinidad, and familia. With that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by queerness here at the Latinx Roundtable. Queerness certainly is an identity, and I identify as a gay man, which I think also makes me a part of the queer family, in that my sexual identity perhaps is not part of the identities that people consider normal, quote unquote, heterosexual cisgender identities typically. So certainly queerness is a sexual identity per se, either pertaining to our sexual orientation or our gender. But queerness is also more than an identity. Queerness is also a call, a project, a methodological epistemology, aka a way of looking at the world. And so when we at the LRT talk about queerness, we are certainly talking about an identity, but we're also inviting everybody, whether you identify as a member of the LGBTQ+ community or not, whether you're an ally or a member of the community, to engage in this project that asks us to question, to transgress, against some norms, whether they be sexual or other, that might be a little bit oppressive. Sometimes I like to give this example of, we can pass laws against racial discrimination, but unless we look at some of the underlying norms in our society that perpetuate racism, we're not getting rid of racism. So queerness is a project that attempts to get us to look at the underlying norms that sustain sexual oppression, among other types of oppression. So with that broader definition of queerness as a project that gets us to transgress and to look at some of the underlying norms, today's event is actually going to have two dynamics. One of them is going to focus on identity. What does it mean to have LGBTQ plus persons as part of our families and as part of our ecclesial contexts? But the second one, broadening the definition of queerness, is what does it mean to look at how we, at the norms and the rules that operate in families, and how can we perhaps transgress against some of these norms and rules that operate in families in a way that is oppressive? Okay, so we're gonna notice those two dynamics taking place in our conversation today, and so that is what it means to talk about Latinidad at the intersection of queerness and spirituality. Okay, the second thing I want to say is that all of our presenters are members of our theological family. We identify as Catholic, but so certainly our Catholic theological background is going to be a part of the presentation today, but obviously this translates to many ecclesial contexts, and you'll find many ways of doing that. But you might have to do a little bit of translating to your own tradition, and the Q&A is a great opportunity to also engage in that part of the conversation. Finally, and I'm disclosing this with their permission, the members of our guests today, the members of our panel, are not people who identify as part of the LGBT community, but have family members who do. And so they are coming as allies who are actively also engaging in this queer epistemology by being allies and by being amazing theologians who are trying to create a better church and a better world. With that, I turn over to them. Let me introduce them. Then I'm going to give them the floor first to MT Dávila and then to Natalia Imperatori-Lee to discuss their understanding of family, Latinidad, spirituality, etc. MT Dávila is an associate professor of religious and theologies studies at Merrimack College. As a Latinx ethicist, her research interests intersect racial justice, migrant justice, public theology, political theology, nonviolence, and liberation theology and ethics. She has published numerous articles on immigration, abortion, nonviolence, and politics. Our other presenter today, Natalia Imperatori-Lee, is the chair of the Department of Religion at Manhattan College and a philosophy professor. Her research interests focus on Catholic ecclesiology, in particular, the intersection of ecclesial identity with feminist and Latinx Catholic thought. Her book, Cuéntame, explores how narratives shape ecclesiology, which is the study of the church. And she is also interested in the relationship between Catholic theology, sexuality, and education, the intersection of Mariology and ecclesiology, intercultural theology, gender studies, and the relationship of women, the poor, and other marginalized groups to church structure and governance. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists, MT Dávila and Natalia Imperatori-Lee, and I will turn it over to Doctora MT Dávila.
Hello, buenas noches. Well, good evening to the East Coast and buenas tardes to those of you on the West Coast. And thank you for this invitation to conversation in what I call my one of my chosen families, the Academic Latino Academy chosen family. So first, to locate myself, as Ish mentioned, as part of the queer methodology or project, certainly as an ecclesial project. I don't identify as part of the LGBTQ community, but I do, my family is what I've been terming a Catholic queer family or queer Catholic family. So we are Catholic, but we have a transgender child, we have a non-binary child, that's in our nuclear family, and then extended family beyond that, asexual, gay, etc., in various branches of the family. And what I wanted just to take a few minutes to talk about was really that experiential and pastoral perspective of what it is that where I've seen my family occupy certain spaces in the life of the church, and what that has meant for me and what challenges that has brought for me and my husband and the broader family. So one of the pieces, one of the questions, and one of the challenges as a Christian family is the focus on passing on the faith, and the focus on the family being the domestic church, the family being that place where children first learn the essentials of the faith and learn to love the faith, right? It's not that we're just teaching them this topic, but we're teaching them to love this home. And I'll refer to that concept of home in a minute, because I think that's really important. And to go through the motions of this home. In my case, that started falling apart really fast. And I'll share an actual moment because we can actually pinpoint it. There was a moment in which my children were in their religious education program, and the topic that they were discussing, and this was, they were, I think, third graders, maybe even younger, third, fourth graders, was marriage, right? And family life, and the Christian vision for family life. And in that, they had the vision of using a pre-recorded video by Cardinal Sean O'Malley from the Archdiocese of Boston, speaking in his tone, a person who's had no experience on having a family, speaking to children about what family life meant, and what it meant to have a marriage between a man and a woman, and what it meant to be a woman in a family, and what it meant to be a man in a family. And at that moment, my children looked at me and said, we're done. This is not for us. We're not hearing us represented. We're not hearing us being welcome. We're not hearing us being encouraged to bring our gifts and be part of this world that's, we know, is really important to you, but it's not connecting with us. And like I said, that really was the moment where se jodió la cosa. Everything started just breaking down for us as a family in terms of our involvement with the Catholic tradition. So a few things, let me just to unpack that, a few things from that. One is the notion of harm, the notion of religious harm. And I know we throw that around in very different ways, and maybe even the phrase religious trauma is used. But when that extends to the family unit, when that extends to something as central to holding a family together as the practice of the faith, the daily and the and weekly practice of the faith and the sacraments, especially in a Latino family, or immigrant families in general, that it causes a lot of harm. That causes direct harm. So we can maybe later on in our discussion, because I don't want to take too much time initially on that. As a consequence of that, there is shame that has to be worked through, both internally to the family, but each family member themselves. Like, what does this mean for me as a person of faith? What does it mean for me as being beloved by God, if that language begins to develop or not, and maybe that language becomes stunted, and does not gain wings and take flight. So you have to kind of make sense of yourself, your own identity, both as a child of a family, but also as a child of God, and make sense of that identity within the context of shame, as shame that the harm has caused. The next one, and this is where I mentioned home, that concept of home, is that there is no, the church ceases to be a place of welcome. The term in Spanish that I think about is acogida, which is a little bit different. Of course, terms don't translate equally. Acogida is sort of a very tender welcome. It's not a welcome like you walk in through the doors of a law firm or a mall, you know, to go shopping, but it really is a tender embrace of you and your identity and who you are, and being beloved in that and being taken in that. So I just keep doing that hand expression, right, of being taken in. That is gone for many queer Catholic families, as families, qua families, especially when little children are involved, and we want to sort of both include them in this welcome, but also protect them from potentially being harmed in their identity and in their sense of who they are and who are they developing into being. And that brings to mind, you know, I'm thinking of someone like the theology of Roberto Goizueta and his concept of acompañamiento, right? That the kind of walking with, being with the other, and in a way that the church is called to do, churches are called to do, that again takes identity very seriously, takes family relations very seriously, takes a diversity of situations that are not normative very seriously, and yet still we walk along, we accompany folks in those situations. That becomes absent from it. So one of the things that I said to Ish that I wanted to, that I've been thinking about a lot is the concept in we're now in the midst of the second part of the synod in the Catholic Church. So they're having this big meeting, with a lot of new elements to it, like the inclusion of laity and the inclusion of people who are openly gay, et cetera, as part of their representation in this synod. But it focuses on asking three questions, and in the spirit, reflecting in the questions of what brings you joy about your faith, what brings you hope about your faith, and what are you concerned about, or what brings you grief. I would bring it into the sense of grief. So I think that there's the piece where I find joy and hope is that, you know, in people like Ish, in people like Natalia, in this family that are taking the theological world and pushing it to consider notions of family, notions of belonging, notions of ecclesiology, what constitutes the church, who are the sacraments for, how does a family feel included in the practice of the sacraments or not, and other kinds of rituals. What does it mean to grow in the faith? So that brings me a lot of joy. Teaching certainly brings me a lot of joy when I get a classroom in front of me and I get to teach them. And I know that they're coming from all their variety of identities, and I need to give them an acogida. I need to build a home in my classroom, a theological home, a spiritual home in my classroom for them. That's a place of joy. But I think a place of concern is just that the tripping that the church does with its language, with its expressions. It doesn't get it right. It doesn't get it right, and it doesn't realize the harm that not getting it right does. It's just like slices at the soul. And some people can gather those pieces and make them whole each time. But some people refuse to be harmed that way. And then that church is no longer for them. They might go on to find another church, or they might just say, you know, religious life in organized religion is not for me. And that is a big concern, because I do feel like we are entrusted, we meaning all churches, theologians, it's any ecclesial body is entrusted with the care of souls. And when we do not do that well, I think, you know, the responsibility and the impact of that can last for generations. And so that's just by way of introduction, a lot to unpack there, but we'll hear each other out and have some open conversation later on as well. So thank you for hearing me, and Natalia, you can take it.
Gracias, MT, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm so grateful to be part of this panel. MT and I have been friends since before we had our own nuclear families. So it has been many, many, many years of acompañamiento that we've had with each other. So I'm very, very grateful to Ish for bringing us together. Like MT and Ish mentioned, I myself don't identify as part of the LGBTQ community, but I do have many people whom I love dearly are. Not just beloved uncles and cousins, cousins who died in the AIDS crisis, several of my teachers who midwifed me into this vocation. And one of my children identifies as non-binary. 4 of my children's uncles are gay. So it's a big queer Catholic family as well. And my goal tonight is to kind of zoom out a little bit historically and think about what it is about the intersection of Latinidad and queerness that can be dangerous and that can be fruitful. So the first thing I want to piggyback on one of MT's themes, which is the theme of shame. I think that shame is an incredibly powerful force in all of our lives, but especially in the Latino community in a communal way. Whether it's the power of what we call the qué dirán, right? What will they say, as a source of sort of judgment, like amorphous judgment coming from the outside. What will people say about me? What will people say about my family? What will people say about my children? How does this look? How does this look? How does this look? With which we were, many of us at least, I know I was, all raised. Or the desire to be quote unquote normal, or to be American, or to be successful. I feel like shame is this omnipresent force in our community. Shame about how we look, shame about how we vote, shame about where we live, shame about who we love. And until we can name this reality as a motivator and a demotivator for action, we cannot really move forward in productive ways, because naming a problem is central to kind of being able to see it and address it. A second sort of not unrelated issue that I think we need to talk a little bit about is the legacy of colonialism and the legacy of the unresolved sexual trauma that has generational impacts, both before us and into our futures. I think about the way that Latinx communities have structured the ideas of masculinity and femininity, particularly the more toxic embodiments of this in machismo and its sort of counterpart, Marianismo. In machismo, or this machista paradigm, masculinity is, due in part to colonial violence, constantly under threat, and therefore must constantly be asserted through violence, through aggression, through sexual promiscuity, through the collection of sexual partners in a public way. And perhaps that is reflected in people's families through half siblings and illegitimate children and things like that, that grew our families into this kind of big, messy bunch, which was certainly the case in my grandparents' generation. As a counterpoint to that, we have a construction of femininity that is less violent, but not less harmful. This Marianista paradigm expects women to be the kind of soul of the family, who is praying for everyone, but also in a way paying for everyone's sins. The woman is expected to do all of the mourning rituals for everyone, like on behalf of the whole family, women mourn. They suffer for everyone else's redemption. Sometimes it can feel like a suffering Olympics. And the result of this is that the mark of good womanhood is sadness, right? A happy woman somehow indicates bad, being a bad woman, being a loose woman, being a woman who's living outside of the confines of what is expected. Whereas suffering and sadness is synonymous with good womanhood. It's kind of a mark of honor. And this is a profoundly damaging paradigm for everyone, whether you are cisgender, transgender, heterosexual, homosexual, somewhere in between. It is a harmful binary, more harmful even just than the regular gender binary, I think. So what comes out of this is, as I mentioned, this legacy of illegitimacy, not just being half siblings and, you know, this person's half siblings and that person's half siblings and whatever, but also the shame and the trauma of being the half sibling in a family and all the expectations and the sort of stigma that comes with that. The prevalence of sexual violence in families. Latina families are not exempt from sexual violence, perpetrated by family members or by others, but most likely by family members like everyone else. This is not something that is talked about. It's buried because, again, of the power of shame in our community. So those are some aspects, I think, of Latinidad, of the history of colonial kind of violence that bring more harm, that compound the kind of trauma that people in the LGBT community already are facing. But it's not all doom and gloom and sadness. I don't want us to kind of leave here hanging our heads, because I do think that there are many aspects of ecclesial life that are themselves pretty queer. The first thing that comes to mind is the canon of saints. There are more than 10,000 recognized saints in Roman Catholicism who we revere as examples, as heroes of the faith, as people who lived exemplary holiness. And of those 10,000, only about 500 were ever married. So it's an infinitesimally small percentage who were married, and an even smaller percentage of those who lived as husband and wife and didn't just like live as brother and sister for their entire lives. So the overwhelming majority of these exemplars of faith that we revere did not conform to the expectations of heterosexual marriage and family. Those heroes of the faith, those examples to us all, lived outside of traditional marriages. And many, the more you get into it, had very queer understandings of Jesus, of God, of their relationship to the divine that was deeply embodied and very transgressive. And that's what we think of when we think of sort of queer methodologies. How are we transgressing? How are we stepping outside of these paradigms? There are lots of passages in scripture where Jesus is reaching out, where Jesus is inclusive of people who were outside of the sort of sexual bounds of the time, outside the quote unquote sinfulness. And you know this as people who are interested in Christianity at all, that Jesus was a very transgressive figure who was reaching out in transgressive ways to people in the community who were isolated, who were looked down upon, etc. So there are many examples of transgression, of queer practice, of queer communities, the earliest churches, the injunction against marriage in the earliest sort of Christian communities. All of these things are examples for us and sort of signposts along the way that it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be a cardinal who is childless, maybe even a childless cat man talking about what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. There are signposts in the Gospels, there are signposts in the history of the church that allow us to think beyond that in a transgressive way. The last thing I'll say is that Latina communities know a lot about chosen families. In my family, we call it Cuban cousins, people who are not related to you at all, but we call them our cousins anyway. And surely for the Latinos who are here or watching, this is a reality, right? You have cousins who are first cousins, cousins who are eighth cousins, and cousins who their mom and your mom have been best friends your whole life. We have a robust tradition of compadrazgo and comadres. We have traditions of accepting all kinds of weird people in our families. So my question is, why can't we translate that into our church? I think some of it is our colonial fear of a punitive male God, right? But I also feel like we can free ourselves of that there's enough resource in both cultural Latinx Catholicism, but also in the history of the Christian churches, that we can step outside of this harmful paradigm. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's give these two a round of applause. Thank you so much for your amazing, amazing insights. I've honestly already learned a lot. I took 1,000 notes. Just by way of like a quick facilitated discussion, I have two questions. The first one piggybacks on what Natalia was already doing. Dr. Imperatori-Lee, you said something that strikes me. You know, it was a shift in your comments. Like, it's not all doom and gloom. Here's queerness, right? Because I often, as a queer man, I am very weary of talking about queerness as we have to help these poor queer people, right? It's almost like, you know, certainly it'd be great to have all this welcome, all this help. Yes, absolutely. We are in many ways vulnerable, depending especially on whether you're, for example, a transgender person of color versus a cisgender white gay man. There's a spectrum of privilege within the LGBTQ plus community. Yes, I agree with that. And I think that welcome is important. But I think what you said, it's not all just that. There is also a wisdom that is present in queerness, right? And you started talking about how, you know, these families, like traditionally, we already have queerness inherent in our family, and that the church should really recognize that inherent queerness, which, to be honest, is also in the Holy Family, considering that Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus. So that there's some sort of, I mean, depending on which theologian you talk to, there's a polyamorous relationship between God, Mary, and Joseph, and they fathered a child. But, you know, I don't want to get too excommunicated for today. So we are going to talk, instead, we're going to limit it to the acceptable forms of queerness. No. Joking aside, the question that I have for you is, in light of this queer wisdom, right? How would you define family? And I'm asking you here to be like constructive. How do you define familia in light of queerness? Whoever wants to start can start.
Well, I'll start. I remember I grew up as the daughter of the woman who was the kind of center of the family, right? Where everyone who came from Cuba stayed at my house, right? Every time there was a family gathering, it happened at my house. And I felt very much a part of this huge family of somewhat not all their people. And I remember sort of in learning about all of these many, many people who would come through our house, just learning really crazy things about their life. You know, oh, their mom was not married to your great grandfather, but don't worry about it. She was the niece of your great grandmother, and that's just something that used to happen, and we just roll with it. And we just roll with it. And I think that is kind of a cornerstone of what familia means to me, right? They are the people who show up for you and roll with you regardless. And I have experienced that in my family, right? People who show up. And I have experienced that as part of my chosen family as well, right? That there's a capaciousness where it's not, well, you know, we all have just these series of obligations and we're obligated to these people. No, it's a kind of more radical acceptance. Oh, yes, your cousin Pepito. Yes, well, you know, he has his own issues, but we love him. You know, and Fulanita, yes, well, you know, she sometimes screams at herself in the privacy of her own room, but that's okay. We love them. We love them. We love them. And so that kind of love without prejudice, without peros, that's, I think, what family means for me.
Sorry, I was unmuting myself. I love that. I want to be before I kind of grab onto that. One of the pieces that I wanted to mention is that there are actual not just, Natalia mentioned colonialism as and as sort of something that creates waves and generations of sexual trauma, racialized sexual trauma. But I want to add to that capitalist family trauma, in the sense that to that capacious radical generosity of these families that involve all kinds of spirits and souls and peoples, there's the counter move by the development of the atomized family, mom, dad, 2.5 kids, not sure how the half happened, picket fence, that becomes the ideal in post-war US, over against the multifamily living, where los tíos are above, and especially your tío that never actually grew out of his mother's skirts, but he's living with abuela downstairs, and like all these things that Natalia was describing, where there were actual ordinances against building these kinds of dwellings, allowing people to live in multifamily homes where multiple generations and multiple relations are there. But even in newer waves, post-World War II, newer waves of migrants, the kinds of ordinances that got passed are, okay, well, you have a 3-bedroom apartment, but that 3-bedroom apartment can only be shared by this atomic family of mom, dad, and kids. It cannot be, you cannot put in grandma and uncle and aunt and your neighbor's cousin from the same village in, India or wherever they're coming from, because there's a limit, and the limit is how many levels of relations how many degrees of relation can live in the same dwelling. And there's still communities that very much have those laws in effect. So that's again, a colonial capitalist imposition on that Latino capaciousness and migrant capaciousness of families that want to bear with each other and want to bear burdens with each other, regardless of whether or not they meet any particular sort of standard. And where it gets complicated, and again, I keep going to that harm piece, is when that becomes theologized as normative, as theologically normative, as doctrinally normative, so that, we think of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus as the model of this atomic family, foregoing what Ish mentioned, that there was a Holy Spirit in there, there is a God in there, there are angels too, right? So that conception was messy, and more than 2 people were in that conception. There was all kinds of beings in that conception. But now we've made it the doctrine that it's this one nuclear family, that, isn't it interesting how it matches the American ideal of this singular family. And so it essentially, it prevents and limits the kinds of connectivity that we can, it doesn't limit the kinds of connectivity that we can make, because we make them anyway. But how do we bring them into the church? How do we bring them into the life of the church? In what ways are they welcome? In what ways does the church give it an acogida, where everyone is okay, you want in your wedding for all these people to walk you down the aisle? Mira, let them walk you down the aisle. They raised you from the time you were 2 years old to the time you were 12, and then from the time you were 12 and up, or whatever. But that's not, that doesn't seem to have a place especially in the US churches. Actually, where I have been seeing sort of a bigger welcome is in churches and programmings that have a deeper understanding of addiction in some way and recovery, which happen to be often evangelical churches or sort of Pentecostal churches, because they do understand that sometimes we have to let go of family members who are dragging us back into addiction or who are not conducive to our recovery, or who are toxic to us. And so other members of the church become part of that family, or you end up moving, same church, right? But, fulanito of one family has to really move out of there. They still love that family. That family is still part of the church, but is not conducive to fulanito's recovery. So fulanito ends up living in this other family from the church, and they communicate. They see each other on Sundays at church, and the pastor is just fine with it. And santo y bueno. And so that messiness among families is accepted for the sake of recovery, for the sake of not falling back into addiction, and for the sake of staying sober. I've seen that sort of messiness being welcome into the church in those contexts.
Thank you both. And T, when you were talking, two things kind of came to me when you were talking about, the Holy Family, the Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, plus the angels, plus God, but then it gets theologized, right? There's what we read in Scripture, but then we make meaning out of that. The meaning making, the theologization, gets theologized and becomes normative and sets us. But interestingly, we kept Mary as a virgin. So it goes back to what Natalia was saying about the woman needs to, cover up, say, do not enjoy your life. Do not even think about having sex, right? This is the model family. And by the way, the woman is virgin. We don't talk about Joseph's virginity. I've never heard the virgin Joseph. But that's kind of interesting,
We can
right?
start that devotion, little candle to the Virgin Joseph.
The Virgin Joseph. Let's start that tradition. At the Pacific School of Religion, you heard it first, the CLGS. The other thing that struck me is this was when you were talking earlier about queer family. My partner, my parents are going to meet my partner's parents during Thanksgiving. It's coming up. And so now that my family stopped harassing me to get into a serious relationship, now they're asking me questions about, well, wait, if you guys get married, who proposes to who? And who walks who down the aisle? And also who pays for the wedding? Because there's no girl here. So they're all asking me all these questions. I think they're coming to terms with the fact that they are in a queer family. And I love that you kind of owned that and brought in queer family to the family's queer. If you have a member of the family, everyone has to contend with this sexual normativity. Every single person now is automatically challenged. They're not, what they take for granted, that cookie cutter, model, heteronormative, normative model gets challenged immediately. It gets upended, right? So if I can get a little practical, what are some practical advice or considerations? What is some practical advice or considerations that you have for families with queer members, and also for how LGBTQ plus people, LGBTQ plus Latina people, Latinx people can, navigate Latinx family? The latter one should probably be the premise of a TV show. It probably already exists. But yeah, those two questions, like what are some practical advice for Latinx families accepting queer members, but also Latinx queer persons in Latin family?
I probably have more to say on this, but the initial response to that is two things: to be a little bit more aware or comfortable with the intersectionalities that you mentioned, because we tend to bifurcate our responses in some ways, and as a family, we can be incredibly welcoming, incredibly accepting and progressive, or however term you want to say. And then we go to church, and those things are very separate. And sometimes to bring them together is hurtful and makes us have grief and have to mourn certain things, right? Depending on whatever ecclesial context you're part of. So being able to understand those intersectionalities, I think, goes a long way. And also, especially when there's youth, minors involved, to help them understand those intersectionalities. I think they're navigating being queer, they're navigating being Latino, they're navigating being Latino in a particular political landscape, you know, whether it's the US or Puerto Rico or a home country, that doesn't necessarily welcome them. Some of us are navigating school choices based on local government ordinances on treatment. If I want to have want my son to have adequate medical care, I got to limit his college choices, and we got to say, okay, we're gonna have to stay in Massachusetts, pretty much. And so understanding that they're that generation is navigating a lot. And how do we make room if our churches aren't making room for that, for that kind of struggle? How do we as a family make room for that? Whether it's in schools or different circles or circles of friends or circles with other families, because they do need a place to navigate all that in a way that honors their soul and honors their God-given dignity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think there are a few things that I think of when I think of navigating family life, right? Number one is to forgive yourself, you know, which is very hard for me to do. Forgive yourself for not being the perfect child, for not being the perfect parent, for not being the perfect Christian, you know, just kind of letting go of a lot of that self-censure and self-shame is a really important step if we're going to be a safe landing place for our family members. I think the two oldest people I know who dealt constructively with their children coming out to them, the two oldest Latinos, were my father-in-law, rest in peace, and my very close friend's mother. And both of them, you know, had an initial, these were people who were baby boomers, whose children came out to them. And they had an initial kind of moment of kind of recombobulating themselves, coming to grips with it. And then just a sort of, still my child. I still want them to be in this family. My love for this child hasn't changed, despite all of the messages that I was getting from my culture or whatever, that it needed to change. As it turns out, experientially, their love didn't change. And so my father-in-law was like, okay. And my friend's mom was just like, whatever you do in your intimidades doesn't concern me any more than it concerns me what your siblings are doing in their intimidades. And so I love you unconditionally. A second thing that I think works for me when it comes to both raising kids, but also being a person in the world and being a family, actually came from, this is almost embarrassing to say, this is so non-scholarly of me, but whatever, we're being ourselves here. It came from Schitt's Creek. Did you watch that show when they said that nobody is thinking about you the way that you are thinking about you, and to just kind of let it go? That we are so concerned with what people are going to say or think or believe about us and our families and our children and whatever. And we are the only ones at times who are thinking about that. And if there are people who are genuinely judgmental like that, and I know that there are, then protect your children from that harm and be the safe place for them, right? What our kids need more than anything else is just this unconditional safety. And if that means protecting them from generational trauma that was inflicted on you, then we do that. If it means in protecting them from religious harm and religious trauma, then we do that, and we create sort of pockets of sacredness. I think that goes against a lot of our sort of ecclesial desire and our sacramental reality, our desire to share in communion with people who are not like us, and, you know, in broader and ever widening circles. But when it comes to trauma, to safety, to the harm reduction, I think our first responsibility is that to be a safe landing place for our children, because that's how you break cycles of trauma.
Amazing. Thank you both very much for your responses. Would like to turn it over to the audience. Would any of you have, if anybody has a question or a comment that you would like to bounce off ideas, let's go ahead and do that. Please feel free to just unmute yourself and ask at this moment. Or you can type it in the chat as well. I'll read it off.
I should have waited for others to go first, so I apologize. But as theologians, what hope do you have? I'm also Catholic, that there might be any real or meaningful change in the pastoral practice of the Roman Catholic Church with regard to queer people and our families after this next round, second round of the Synod? I don't think I have any hope for change in official teaching of the Church, meaning the Vatican. I understand the Church is much more than just that. I'm trying to get a gauge of your hopefulness.
I was a lot more hopeful at the beginning. And now just kind of seeing how it plays out. I mean, Ish mentioned I wrote this whole book on stories and storytelling and listening and how important it is to listen. And I think what I missed in that text that is now kind of become an obsessive thing for me is that it's not just about listening. It's also about believing, and a willingness to conversion. And that's where I think the Synod, that's the rock I think the Synod is going to kind of falter on. I do think that good listening has happened, but listening for the sake of listening is insufficient, especially if you don't believe or aren't willing to change as a result of what you hear, right? It's like that gospel message, we write this not so that you will listen to it. We write this so that you will believe. And that's the piece that I don't know. I think it on a local level, it can have an impact if we continue to highlight the stories of LGBTQ people who were at the Synod and welcomed and things like that. I think locally it can have an impact, but like you said, magisterially, I think we're too far from where we need to be as a global church. That's what I think. I wish I was hopefuller.
I would say I agree. My place of hope in the Synod, and it comes from the preparatory document for the second session, is a real invitation, or not invitation, but requirement of the church to be a listening church. I have been proposing that synodal, and this is a very Catholic thing, but Roman Catholic thing, but that I propose that synodal is the fifth mark of the church. I mean, if we're going to take it seriously, that we are one holy Catholic, apostolic, and synodal church. Maybe we'll get to that point. And if we get to that point, which that proposal, preparatory document affirmed and invited, there is a profound humility that it requires. And I think in that profound humility, there might be some possibility for deep listening that maybe moves us, inches us to do some correcting of where we have been. So it's more about, will that methodology take traction? Will it be just a synod that gets shoved under the rug like many other synods, with some great insights that we and our students can study in the future, but not really for bishops to use? I'm hopeful that the preparatory document, which is quite different, I think, from other preparatory documents leading toward the Synod, points in the direction of that hard work of humility, and of that truly being a mark of who we are as a church.
Mm-hmm. And for the benefit of those of us who are not Catholic, synodality really refers to, I would say maybe like there's two components of synodality. One I would categorize as a canonical process. It's like synodality is very much like a process of listening in the church where, the idea here is that those who are ordained at the highest level, bishops, cardinals, etc., would be listening to those who are perhaps the quote unquote lower parts of the hierarchy, right? The people associated with the laity as being at the bottom of that pyramid. That pyramid gets inverted. There's like a listening process that takes place, a consultation. But more than just a process, it's also an ecclesiology, which is where MT is getting at. The idea that the Catholic Church at its core should be synodal. And that is born out of the conviction that through our baptism, the Holy Spirit speaks through our lives, including the lives of the faithful. So how can leaders in the church lead the church without understanding the Holy Spirit's revelation through our life, the sense of the faithful, the sensus fidelium? And so synodality at its core is really a process of journeying together through mutual listening. And the reason it's all the rage nowadays is because Pope Francis is facilitating a synod, a canonical process on synodality, the philosophical idea. And so it's kind of interesting to see how the Catholic Church will turn much more consultative. I would use the word collaborative. Would actually take seriously the idea that the Spirit is alive in the entire church, not just at the hierarchical level. And so those of us who are queer kind of have been, this is perhaps not a like Dr. Schlager said, not perhaps how do you call it, a granular type of change at the church teaching on sexuality per se, but rather perhaps a change in how the church operates that would perhaps eventually open the door, as our two guest speakers brought up, for further change. I see a question on the chat. Let's see. Sabina says, let me read. One trend I'm noticing at the Catholic University I work at is that we are doing well at LGBTQ+, and we are doing well at supporting our BIPOC students. I think we are beyond the LGBTQ+ 101 and anti-racism 101 type of sessions that are the point, and are at the point where we need to move toward intersectionality and that acknowledges all part of one's identity. Beyond institutions of higher education, I see too, with LGBTQ+ spaces being mostly for gay, cis, het, white men. Everything else is like a special category of focus, i.e. queer women, trans folks, etc. Are you seeing similar shifts? How may we navigate this moment toward more intersectional learning and recognizing the fullness of who we are? What might this look like in your perfect world? Great question.
What comes to mind immediately with that question, and it is that Sabina, you make the suggestion already within the question of what becomes more expansive, what's the next step, is really examining gender and communities that have different understandings of gender, whether it's Native American, whether it's Filipino, whether it's other Asian Pacific communities, but especially indigenous communities, just being able to listen to stories of practicing gender, of people living into being in their gender that does not conform to anything that even say, cis het gay men or excuse me, white gay men or whatnot might be the norm, or pushing trainings at institutions or whatnot, that we might be at a point where we can learn from who we consider to be very other or truly other, and actually not just in indigenous communities or toward those angles that we feel are more progressive in a way, or that are more expansive in a way, but for example, looking at other world religions, sitting with Muslim brothers and sisters and siblings, and what gender might mean there, what struggles might they be bringing. So that interfaith question, really, really complicating where we are with gender in general, and let alone sexuality, and who do we bring to that table, to that conversation, and what do they need to feel safe in the spaces we create for those conversations. I think sometimes we might be creating spaces for conversations in our institutions, especially when they're colleges and universities, where, you know, Muslim queer people might not feel safe. Jewish queer people might not feel safe, or you know, et cetera. So really examining how we construct these spaces and who are our dialogue partners for that.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah, I think my experience at Manhattan is a little bit different. A lot of our students are Latinos, and a lot of the students who run and make use of the Pride Center are Latinos. So it's very much, and Latinas, very much an intersectional space. We also have a women and gender center that is practically next door to the Pride Center. And so I feel like even geographically, we're able to have these conversations happen in the hallway between, and there's a lot of sort of interchange. And that is a sort of physical intersectionality that allows students and faculty and allies and everyone else to visualize this kind of more intersectional authenticity that we're talking about. I do think that what MT's saying about interfaith work is going to be the next frontier here, to really sort of examine beyond our Christian spaces in my case, Catholic institutions of higher ed, to think about how we can be inclusive and how we can be a safe landing spot for all of our students, regardless of their sort of spiritual locations. And maybe especially, and I think this is probably already the case, that the students who are seeking out the Pride Center see themselves as outside institutional religion. But being able to model ways that you can remain sort of connected, if not affiliated, to these broader traditions, to these concepts of, you know, community, of meaning, and of justice, without putting yourself in danger or in you know, places that would cause you spiritual harm.
Amazing, thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more questions before some announcements. If anybody would like to jump in. Hola, profesora. Gusto
Hola, buenas noches, colegas. Thank you very much for, I'm here home preparando los frijoles y el arroz. So that's what I was in my camera off. I love what you mentioned. So many things to unpack here, but I particularly love what you mentioned about the places of hope, the places of joy, empty, the lugares de esperanza, lugares de alegría, right? And I'm thinking about the classroom, you know, the place where we all, not only as theologians, but as teachers, like we spend most of our week, we would say, you know, with our students. And then, so I wonder, I'm thinking in the students that I teach with, I serve with, I theologize with, on behalf of and for, what mensaje de esperanza, what message of hope could you offer for teacher theologians, for us teachers, to make of this a space of the classroom a space of hope and a space of joy, particularly for those of our students who are aquí y allá, ni de aquí ni de allá, pero aquí y allá, right? So what message of hope, what message of esperanza, what message of hope do you have for teachers so we can better serve our students in the classroom and offer those safe space, how you were saying, Natalia, right? Those safe space for our students.
I have an insight from a student actually that I got this week, because one of the things that happens in my classroom, I teach very introductory courses to Christianity, among other things, and they because of this generation's exposure or lack thereof to sort of the Christian narrative, I end up doing a lot of philosophy of religion first before I bring them into the Christian narrative. And so I've been doing, I was working with students on truth, revelation, authority, and imaginary, like how that kind of flow ends up determining how a person views their universe and how a community views their universe and makes meaning of the world. And so I was doing an exercise with them, asking them to sort of identify, said, and everyone has one. This is humanity. Everyone operates out of a truth that they give authority to, that is revealed to them, that they feel has been revealed to them, that then shapes how they view the world. And so I asked them, can you identify that for you? And this is not about like, I'm from Florida and that, I'm talking about though that does shape how you see the world, right? Not that. And I had a student, after we were all done, come down and ask me, professor, so this is a non-binary student, he, him pronouns, beautiful African-American student. And he's like, professor, what is your truth? What would you say is that truth for you? And I kind of went here and there and nowhere. And then, so not a very evangelical response, because I should have said like, Jesucristo is mi truth. But here's where the insight comes to your question in terms of hope and what do we do in the classrooms? For those students who are ni de aquí ni de allá, pero de aquí de allá. They went into the concept of fear and how much fear shapes the truth that we can get to see, right? That sometimes there's so much fear around them and in them that they can't even, that they only get to see a little bit of that magnificent truth of being a beloved child of the creator and creation. And then from there to build communities that share in that love and that expand that love. So I think though, to the extent that our classrooms can be spaces where we name the fears, right? We have to name them. We have to accept how they operate, but then we disarm them. We just, break them down and have them operate, have them see their souls from a perspective and the soul of the other from a perspective that's not tainted by fear. Then that is, I think, brings hope to them. That makes a space of hope, I think.
I do think that being from Florida does fundamentally shape a person, especially from Miami, right? But I think, well, those of us who are theologians in this crowd probably do view the classroom as a sacred space. I know I've had many, many experiences of God in classrooms, and it's been one of the places where I have felt the divine most closely. And as I spend more time on the other side of the desk, as I did sitting at the desk, I find so much hope in our students, in their capacity to go beyond binaries, in their capacity to be brave and honest about who they are, that I find myself sort of in the learning seat again, and letting them take the lead. I teach sexuality and the sacred, and I have learned more in that class than maybe I did in graduate school about bravery, about self-awareness, about the courage to be who you are, etc. So for me, the classroom is a profound place of grace and of hope. And so as long as we can preserve that safety for the students that are entrusted to our care, I think it's again, I won't be ordained in the Roman Catholic Church, and I don't have too much hope that women are going to be ordained, that I'll see them anyway in my lifetime. But in that moment, I feel like we build the kingdom together, whether it is sort of talking about truth in very real, honest, sort of raw ways with our students, or whether it is sort of allowing them to be a truth to us. That to me is a profoundly hopeful and transformative thing.
Amazing. I want to say thank you to both of our guests, Doctora Dávila, Doctora Imperatori-Lee, for being with us. Thank you to all of our attendees for being here and engaging in this important conversation. Again, happy Hispanic Heritage Month, and thank you for engaging with culture and our heritage, especially as we know, queerness is often located in the family, and how we maneuver these familial and ecclesial spaces is incredibly important for LGBTQ plus persons and our loved ones. I will turn it over to Amy, who has some final announcements and will dismiss us today. Okay.
Okay. I just put in the chat a feedback form for everybody. If you would like to share your thoughts with us, we would love to hear them. I want to thank you, Dr. Ish, MT, Natalia. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your insight, and for taking a very hard subject for a lot of us and making it more accessible, and have some joy in it too. We have one more event in this series that'll take place 2 weeks from now on Tuesday, October 15th, with activist and organizer Elizabeth Melendez-Rivera. So you can mark your calendars for Si Se Puede, Queer Spirituality and Latinx Social Activism, to round out the end of our Hispanic Heritage Month series. We also have a few other events coming up this semester. We'll be hosting a book club for Queer God de Amor by Miguel Diaz on November 5th, 12th, and 19th at 4 p.m. Pacific. And Miguel will be joining us for our last session on November 19th. If you're interested in being part of that, we have another form for you to fill out, and these will be posted online also. Yeah, there it is. Thank you, Dr. Ish. So please sign up if you're going to attend this, because there's a book involved, and we would love to be able to provide that to you if you're in need. So finally, we have a special hybrid event on December 3rd, which is Bomba Puerto Rico. I'm going to butcher it. Penal, Puerto Ricanal. Queer theology meets Caribbean Afrofuturism, with a musical group, Beatty Tambo, which will take place in the Babe Museum at Pacific School of Religion at 6 p.m. You can join us in person or online, and the event will feature our very own Dr. Alexandra Rosado Roman. So I'm just delighted to have been here, to learn so much from you about family and culture. It makes a lot of sense to me as I try to decode what is Latin in my blood, what is not. So thank you so much for that new perspective, and I appreciate all of you, and we look forward to seeing y'all next time.
All right, thank you all very much, and bendiciones. Have a good day. Thank you all.
Thank you. Buenas noches.
Thank you, Doctora Dávila, Doctora Imperatori-Lee. Thank you
Good
for being
night.
here.
Thank you so much.